All right, so on Tuesday we talked about complex numbers. So complex numbers are numbers that involve I. So we're going to be solving quadratic equations, and some of these may have complex numbers as our solutions. So when solving with an x squared, so we did this in 3.1 too. If we have just an x squared and no other x's, we want to move everything to the other side and just get the x squared all by itself. So I'm going to subtract 4, move that to the other side. So I have x squared is equal to negative 4. Now how would I get x all by itself? How do I get rid of the squared? Square root it. So we have x is equal to, now we have to be careful. Anytime we take the square root of both sides of our equation, what do we need? Plus or minus. Well, what's the negative turn into? An I. We want to take it out and turn it into an I. And then what's the square root of 4? 2. So our answer would be plus or minus 2i. On the homework, I'm not sure how it wants the answer types. I don't think that there's a plus or minus. It probably just wants you to put it separate. So we have negative 2i and positive 2i. So these would be like the two answers. Because I don't think that there's a plus or minus button on the homework. So let's do B. Again, we see that we have just an x squared. So we want to move everything else to the other side. So what should I move first? How would I move the negative 11? Add 11 to move it to the other side. Perfect. So we have 2x squared is equal to negative 36. What would we do next? Divide by 2. So x squared is equal to what? Negative 18. Awesome. Now what would we do next to solve? Square root both sides, so it cancels out with the squared. Anytime I take the square root of both sides, what do I need? Plus or minus. Now here's 18 a perfect square? No. So we want to break it down and see when we simplify the square root of 18, negative 18, what do we get? Well, let's do one step at a time. So let's take the negative out. What does that turn into? An I. What are 2 factors of 18? 9 and 2, and 2 factors of 9. So what would we circle? So what comes to the outside? 3i. Awesome. What stays on the inside? 2. So our answer would be plus or minus 3i square root 2. On the next page, finding the zeros is the same thing that we were doing. We just changed the f of x to be 0, and we solve. So I want to get the x squared all by itself, so I have to move everything else to the other side. What would I move first? What do I move first? 20. So let's subtract 20. So we have negative 20 is equal to 4x squared. Bless you. What do we do next? Divide by 4. So negative 5 is equal to x squared. Awesome. Then we're going to take the square root of both sides to get rid of the squared. So be careful. Anytime we take the square root of both sides, what do we need? Plus or minus. Can we simplify the square root of negative 5? We can take the negative out, and what does it turn into? An I, so it'd be I on the outside, I square root 5. Awesome. So plus or minus I square root 5. So for the last 3, we're finding the zeros. So we just change f of x to be 0. And then we solve. We want to get x squared all by itself. So what would I move first here? 7. So let's subtract 7. 0 minus 7 would be negative 7 is equal to x squared. What would we do next? Square root both sides, so it cancels out with the squared. So we get x equals what? plus or minus. Awesome. The negative comes out and turns into an I, so we have I square root 7. Any questions there? Let's do 21. We want to get the x squared all by itself, so what should we move first? The 4. So we have to add 4 to move it to the other side. 0 plus 4 is 4. So 4 is equal to negative x squared. What would we do next? Awesome. Divide by negative 1. So negative 4 is equal to x squared. What do we do next? Square root both sides. So we get x is equal to what? Plus or minus, awesome, 2i. We take the negative out, turns into an I, and the square root of 4 is 2. And then anytime we take the square root of both sides, do not forget your plus or minus. For 22, what should we do first? Subtract 1. So we get negative 1 is equal to 9x squared. Divide by 9. So negative 1 over 9 is equal to x squared. Then what? Square root both sides. So the square root cancels out with the squared. So I have x is equal to what?
Plus or minus 1/3 I.
Awesome. Plus or minus. Remember when we have a fraction under a radical, it's like saying the square root of 1 over the square root of 9. What's the square root of 1? 1. And what's the square root of 9? 3. So this would be 1/3, but what about the negative? Turns into an I. So I'm just going to go over a couple questions that we did in 3.1. So some of the questions from 3.1 were similar to what we just did. Let's say we have x squared plus 1 is equal to 10. What would I need to do to solve for x? Subtract 1. So x squared is equal to 9. Then what? Square root both sides. So x is equal to? Just 3? Don't forget the plus or minus. Anytime you take the square root of both sides, you need plus or minus. So this one was number 1. We're going to do 3 questions together. Any questions there? All right, let's do number 2. So the other type of question that we saw from 3.1 was if we have a parentheses squared with an x in it. So let's say x minus 2 squared plus 4 is equal to 11. What would we do to solve here? Move the 4 over. We want to get the x minus 2 squared all by itself, so we want to move the 4 over. So we subtract 4. So x minus 2 squared is equal to 7. Then what do we do? How do I get rid of the squared on top? We don't FOIL. How do we get rid of the squared? How did I get rid of the squared on the x here? Square root. So we're doing the same thing. We square root both sides to get rid of the squared. So x minus 2 is equal to what? Just the square root of 7? Plus or minus the square root of 7. So anytime you take the square root of both sides, you need the plus or minus. Now what's the last step going to be? Add 2. Can I add 2 and the square root of 7? Are they like terms? No. So we just leave it on the outside. So x is equal to 2 plus or minus the square root of 7. one more question that we're going to do that we saw in 3.1. So I'm going to call this number 3. Let's say we have x squared minus x is equal to negative 30. Just kidding, positive 30. Yeah, positive 30. So x squared minus x is equal to 30. What would we do to solve here? So if I have an x squared and an x, I can't just square root both sides. I can't add like terms. I don't have like terms.
Just add the x on the other side and then square root.
Can't do that either. Move the 30 to make it equal to 0. So we have x squared minus x minus 30 is equal to 0. Why do we move the 30? What do we want to do next? So we want to factor. If you have an x squared and an x, these are not like terms. You can't combine them together, so we have to factor. In order to factor, it has to be equal to 0, so that's step 1. So we're good there. Now we want to see what are 2 factors of negative 30 that add to negative 1? Negative 6 and positive 5. Perfect. So this factors into x minus 6 and x plus 5 equals 0. Now we factored, but we have to solve. The directions say solve. We need to find what x is equal to. So what would I do next? Awesome. We set both of the parentheses equal to 0. So x minus 6 equals 0. X plus 5 equals 0. And then we just solve each little equation for x. So I'd add 6 to both sides on the first one. So x is equal to positive 6. Second one, I would subtract 5. So x is equal to negative 5. So those are the 3 different types of equations that we saw in 3.1. So this will help for tomorrow when you guys have the review worksheet to do. So you either will have just an x squared, where you get that all by itself. You have parentheses squared, so again, you get that all by itself. Or if you have an x squared and an x, this is the ones where we have to factor.